In the 5th year of our marriage, I became pregnant and Henry cried with joy. Everyone says I'm lucky to marry a wealthy upstart like Henry. But he never mentioned the female celebrity he kept outside. It seems that everyone has forgotten that I was also the girl to whom he confessed his love with red eyes when he was 17. His brother secretly advised him, "You are such a bastard, aren't you afraid that Grace will divorce you?" Henry was fearless and said with a lazy smile, "She won't." Later, I aborted the child without making any noise or fuss. After the news came out, Henry flew back from London overnight. "I'm 6 weeks pregnant, should I keep it?" The doctor asked this question as a routine matter, then lowered his head to look at the list, waiting for my reply. I lowered my eyes, gently placed my hands on my flat abdomen, and couldn't help trembling all over. I couldn't answer this question immediately, so I reached out and grabbed the bag beside me, thanked the doctor, and walked out. When destiny's gift comes at the right time, it is a gift. But when it is inappropriate, it becomes a burden. The arrival of this child was like a crack in time, which shattered the love and hate of the past 12 years and defeated me together with the biting wind. Once upon a time, the child that Henry loved so much has now become a burden. At that time, we were still young and no one knew how long the rest of our lives would last. Only Henry, the 18-year-old boy, stood straight, shining brightly in the cracks of sunlight. I looked up and asked him, "What are you thinking about, so absent-minded?" He lowered his head, and his thick eyelashes trembled. "Think about my wish." "What wish?" He exclaimed exaggeratedly, "Grace, I only have one wish in my life, and you can't even remember it. How can a person have only one wish in his life? Don't lie to me." I didn't know what Henry's lifelong wish was when he was 18 until I was 22. In the shabby, cold air-filled rental house, in front of the simple, cheap cake, he whispered, "Grace and Henry will grow old together and have many children and grandchildren. Grace, let's have a daughter in the future. It would be best if she looks like you, with big eyes, fair skin, and the ability to shake her chubby hands and call me daddy." The room was full of children and grandchildren. I held the checklist in my hand and tears fell. I subconsciously picked up my phone and called Henry. This was the first time I took the initiative to call him since we had a fight 4 years ago. But the next second, the phone rang only twice and then was hung up. I was a little stunned, staring blankly at the phone interface. Just at this moment, the mobile phone software pushed a piece of news with an exaggerated and eye-catching title. Betty and her wealthy boyfriend appeared in the villa area, and they were very close. I suppressed the discomfort in my heart and clicked on it with trembling hands. Betty didn't dare to post any information about Henry on public platforms, and occasionally there would be 1 or 2 posts that only secretly featured him in the picture. The media even dared not publish a frontal photo of Henry. In the photo, Betty's face was clearly visible, but only half of the man's back was revealed. No one knows Henry better than me, not to mention that the hand in the photo has a ring on the ring finger. Compared with his expensive clothes, the ring was so plain and cheap that it was not worth mentioning. But even such an inconspicuous ring was bought by me in my first year of work after I saved and spent a full 6 months. Even when we got married, Henry was already worth over 100 million yuan and owned numerous listed companies, but we still used the pair of rings to take our vows. "Mr. Henry, will you take Grace as your wife, and be faithful to her, loving her, for richer or poorer, in sickness or in health, until your death?" "I do." Sitting on the cold iron chair outside the clinic, I smiled mockingly but couldn't stop the bitterness in my heart. What's funny is that I actually had a moment of hesitation because of this unexpected child. I opened my phone and sent a message to Henry, "Come home when you have time, I have something to tell you." Unexpectedly, the other party replied the next second, "I'm busy recently, please contact my secretary in advance." Over the past few years, Henry's business has grown bigger and bigger, and he has countless assets under his name. We have lived in a basement, a rental house in Jinxiuan that cost $800 a month, and now we live in a villa worth over $100 million. After that day, I didn't wait for Henry to come back, but I waited for another person. It was a small private party with some of Henry's friends, and I had no idea how Betty got into the inner room. She stopped me in the corridor. When she saw me, she was obviously stunned for a moment, and curled her lips. It turns out that men are cheap. No matter how beautiful the flowers at home are, they can't help eating shit outside. This was the first time she saw me, but it was not the first time I saw her. She was a big star that everyone was paying attention to, and her figure could be seen on every street corner. Before I could say anything, a mocking voice came from behind me, "You are quite self-aware and you know that you are the shit outside." After saying this, Betty obviously realized that she had just said something she shouldn't have said, and her face looked extremely ugly. I looked back and saw that the person speaking was Jack, Henry's childhood friend and now Henry's partner. I smiled at him, showing courtesy. This was not the first time Betty had provoked others. 2 years ago, she had made a phone call. After the call was connected, she asked proudly, "Henry, will you divorce your wife and marry me?" I guessed that she was demonstrating. On the other end of the phone, I heard the rustling sound of someone getting dressed. The next second, I heard Henry's voice, cold and impatient, "Betty, if you continue to be a bitch, get away from me." "Hey, Henry." The call was hung up urgently, and I dropped the phone and was stunned for a long time. 2 years ago she only dared to act secretly, but this time she actually came into the house to provoke me. I can't think of any other reason except that Henry gave her the promise and confidence. But even so, I didn't bother to say anything more to her and turned around and wanted to leave. But she stopped me and raised her eyebrows and said, "Grace, you and Henry have been fighting for so many years and you no longer have any feelings for each other. It won't look good if you end up as a pair of resentful lovers. Why don't you let go earlier and not help the lovers?" I sneered and said word by word, "Lover?" She crossed her arms and said arrogantly, "Yes, Henry and I truly love each other. In a relationship, only those who are not loved should take the initiative to withdraw, so it is you, Grace, who should withdraw." I looked at her coldly, tearing off all my disguises. I know that I am a mistress, and I am proud of it instead of being ashamed. Henry and I are husband and wife. Between us, even if it is life or death, whether we are together or apart, even if I spend my whole life with him, it is not your turn to intervene. You are standing in front of me so arrogantly, and you want me to withdraw. What right do you have? She seemed to be frightened by me, took a small step back, put her hand on her belly, and said loudly, "Because I am pregnant with his child." My eyes subconsciously moved to her abdomen. At this moment, Betty's voice was like a spiral, spinning in my mind, causing me excruciating pain. Pregnancy? A child. I felt dizzy, as if the whole world was turning upside down. Seeing that I was stunned, she raised her eyebrows and said quickly, "You have been married for so many years and don't have a child. The baby in my belly is his first child. Do you think he will marry me for this child?" I suddenly laughed out loud, and immediately felt that everything in front of me was so boring, as if all the strength was gone from my body, and my hands and feet became weak. At this time, Jack beside me reached out and helped me. "Are you okay?" I smiled at him. "Did you hear that, Henry's first child?" Jack pursed his lips and said nothing. At this moment, footsteps came from behind Betty. I looked up and saw Henry, whom I hadn't seen for many days. The man had a cold face, and he was wearing a straight suit with a black coat over it. His brows were tightly furrowed on his gentle and handsome face. Henry glanced at me, and his obscure eyes fell on Jack's hand that was supporting me. Betty called out to him in surprise. The next second, Henry's face was cold, and his men pulled her hair mercilessly, asking fiercely, "Who told you to come to her? Do you want to die?" Betty screamed and cried, "Henry, I didn't mean to do this. I'm pregnant with your child. Don't you care about your child at all?" Henry looked at her grimly and sneered, "Are you sure it's my child?" He suddenly let go and said sternly, "Get out." Betty covered her head, not daring to look at him again, and ran out in a panic. After she left, there were only 3 of us left in the empty corridor, and silence spread for a moment. Suddenly, Henry tilted his head and looked at Jack. "Jack, do you like Grace?" Jack's face turned red when he heard this, and he said incoherently, You, what nonsense are you talking about?" Henry didn't care what he said, his dark pupils were fixed on me, but he was speaking to Jack. "It's useless for you to like her, Grace is my wife, and she can only be with me in this life." After saying this, Henry withdrew his gaze, turned around and walked out. I saw Jack chasing after him and scolded him in a low voice, "Henry, if you keep doing this, aren't you afraid that Grace will divorce you?" The word divorce seemed to irritate Henry. He paused and replied after a while, "She won't." I looked at the message from Jack on my phone. "This bastard is so fearless just because he relies on the fact that you love him. Jack is a playboy. People say he is a playboy. The reason why he has not married yet, according to him, is that he does not want to be restricted in his freedom. Even Jack thinks you're an asshole. So, Henry, how can you be sure that I will always love you? When we were young, no one would have imagined that the deep love among young people would also lead to disgust with each other and verbal abuse of each other. 17-year-old Henry has a lot, knowledge, family background, good looks, and a good character. He is the most dazzling person in Hua No. 1 middle school. At that time, I didn't understand why I only saw his eyes in the noisy crowd. Later I realized that when everything is him, there is nowhere to escape the gaze. Grace was passionate and outspoken back then, and no one would believe that Henry would like me. but for so many years, spring, autumn and summer, he followed me closely. At that time, he never avoided it and was not afraid of the teacher talking to him, he just declared it openly. Well, I like Grace, what does it have to do with her? If you want to punish someone, just punish me. She doesn't know anything. What do you mean by puppy love? No, I just have a one-sided love and am still pursuing her. I was so happy at that time, the corners of my mouth curled up slightly, and I looked at his eyes filled with smiles. I secretly pulled the corner of his clothes and said, Henry, you should be more restrained and study hard. Henry was wearing a black windbreaker, standing lazily, looking at me with his head lowered, his hair hanging naturally down, half covering his narrow eyes, the corners of his eyes slightly raised. No, Jack told me that there are a lot of boys in school who are interested in you, I have to make them give up. How arrogant is he? He stood on the podium with his hands in his pockets, twisting a piece of chalk between two fingers, and nonchalantly doing math problems that no one could solve. While doing it, he explained to his classmates in a casual tone, let XM and FC intersect at point E. As soon as he finished speaking, there was a burst of oh my from the audience. Amid the warm cheers, Henry turned his head to look at me. The afterglow of the setting sun was slanting through the door, and he curled the corners of his lips slightly. I lifted the book and silently covered myself, but behind the book full of the scent of ink, my ears secretly turned red. At that time, the spring breeze was full of tenderness, carrying the plum-flavored thoughts of a girl, and it also blew across the boy's white shirt. The boy's wind-filled school uniform once wrapped up the grandeur of his entire youth. At that time, everyone was envious and said that we were a perfect match, perfectly matched and would be together forever. In the year of the college entrance examination, we got admitted to the same university as we wished, but applied for different majors. The first time Henry waited for me to finish class, my roommate Betty excitedly shook my arm and said, Grace, damn, there's a handsome guy out there looking for you. I asked around for you, it's Henry from the computer department. I looked out of the window and saw Henry leaning against the railing. He was tall and stood out among the crowd, like a crane standing out among chickens. I smiled at him and said silently in my heart, Henry, I know him. At that time, he spoiled me to the point of lawlessness and I became more and more spoiled. I would yell for food in the middle of the night, and early the next morning, he would wait for me downstairs in the dormitory with a hot meal in his arms. When we were in college, we were like millions of other couples, loving and passionate. When his kiss was about to fall, I would also yell angrily, you always look for me and I can't review properly. If I fail the final exam, don't even think about seeing me. Henry smiled sullenly, I'm sorry, it's my fault. How about we go to the library, you do your homework and I won't say anything, okay? Betty described us at that time as childish and enviable. During his junior year, Henry's father passed away, which exposed the company's problems. His mother was forced by creditors to commit suicide by taking pills. Overnight, the pride of the nation was reduced to dust, and I didn't see Henry for nearly a month. Until that day, he walked out of the house, looking thin and with hunched shoulders, and the first words he said were, go ahead, I won't keep you. I looked at him with gnashing teeth, what do you think I like about you? Your money or your family background? Henry, you bastard. My eyes were red, tears were falling one by one, and I couldn't wipe them away. He came forward, bent over and gently wiped my tears. Don't cry, Grace, I can't bear to leave you, but how dare I let you accompany me like this? Henry at that time was all alone, with no parents to look back at and no bright future ahead. But no matter what, his wish has never changed. Henry still wants to grow old with Grace and have many children and grandchildren. When Henry first started his business, he had difficulty in getting funding, so I secretly gave him the dowry money my mother had saved for me. After he knew where the money came from, he rested his head on my shoulder, but held the back of my neck with one hand to prevent me from looking back at him. Silly girl, no matter how incompetent I am, I will never use your money. Keep it well, one day it will be used where it should be used. Later, when his career was just starting to pick up, he encountered difficulties with investors. A glass of liquor cost him 100,000 yuan. That night he raised 2 million yuan in investment and was sent to an ambulance due to gastric perforation. At that time, he was often busy until midnight, and sometimes stayed up so late that his stomach ached. He would come into the bedroom to find me, put his cold face against my palm, and call Grace in a low and aggrieved voice. I had such an unbreakable sleep, but I would always wake up at the first sound of his call. When he was extremely tired, he buried his head in my arms and closed his eyes to rest. At that time, I would always gently rub his abdomen and pat the back of his head with one hand, where he had very neat short hair, each strand of hair was jet black, which was my favorite part. He said, Grace, I won't let you regret following me. Later, on the top of the snow-capped mountains, the endless and sharp wind accompanied him. In the Bay of St. Nip, the huge waves became my veil. Henry's proposal caused a sensation in the world, and countless netizens tried hard to dig out the protagonist behind the proposal. Grace, are you willing to marry me? How did I respond at that time? I remembered, my eyes were full of him, I covered my mouth, happiness jumped out of my eyes. Reason collapsed, faith became a sweeping fever, serious and pious. I do, Henry, I love you so much. I have asked myself countless times, do I regret my original choice? I have thought about it countless times. Even if the ending is so unsatisfactory, I think I will not regret having loved each other. Although those 12 years were a ridiculous failure in my youth, they were also the bravest chapter. Fate is cruel, but also kind. Its kindness lies in that as long as you keep moving forward, it will always give you away. I never wanted to watch Betty, but Henry praised her so highly that she jumped from an unknown 18th-tier star to a first-tier star. Her figure appeared in every aspect of my life. When I looked down to search for the obstetrician's contact information, her message was pushed to my eyes again. One was a selfie of her in a cinema, and another was of a brightly lit villa with rows and rows of jewelry and unopened designer bags. Caption for the picture, your apology attitude is quite good, so this princess will forgive you. Anyone could see that someone had booked the entire theater to watch a movie with her. And that pile of bags and jewelry is worth no less than 20 million. I turned off my phone expressionlessly, my heart already empty, no longer able to stir up a single ripple. At this moment, I heard a voice coming from the entrance and I looked up. Henry had his coat draped over his wrist and was bending over to pick up his slippers. As if sensing something, he raised his eyes and looked at me sitting on the sofa. It's so late, why haven't you slept yet? His tone was as brisk as if he had just come home from a day's work and greeted his wife warmly. I looked up at him and smiled. Did you go to the movies with Betty? Henry paused and looked at me in surprise, as if wondering why I would ask this question. Yes, this is the first time in all these years that I mentioned Betty in front of them. After a moment of daze, he picked up the cigarette box on the coffee table, took out a cigarette at random, and the silver lighter with a cold light made a click. Henry leaned back on the sofa, the cigarette on his fingertips was scarlet, and his brows showed the fatigue brought about by power. He narrowed his eyes and asked, do you care? I looked at the cigarette in his hand and subconsciously put my hand on my abdomen, but then I changed my mind and put my hand down. When I cared, did you care? I asked him with a bit of amusement. He should know that I'm talking about what happened 4 years ago, which was the beginning of our broken marriage. At that time, Betty was an 18th-tier newcomer, 18 years old, young and beautiful. That was the most beautiful age. She would open her wet eyes and call him Boss Henry. I was so confident at that time, so confident that I thought as long as Henry sticks to the bottom line, no matter how much trouble others make, it will be useless. But in the end, I overestimated Henry's love for me and underestimated my own possessiveness. He couldn't help but say that she was interesting, and let her get closer step by step. She said goodnight to him every day on WeChat. Only I am like a madman, because I care too much, my madness has destroyed my rationality. But at that time, he was too lazy to even argue with me, so I was the only one performing a one-man show that was earth-shattering and earth-shattering. He just frowned and said impatiently, if she misunderstands, what can I do? I was red-eyed, barefoot, and screaming at the top of my lungs, you are such a slut. If you hadn't given her a chance, how could she have misunderstood? If you hadn't promised her, how could she have committed suicide for you? If Henry had not fallen in love with me, how could she have the confidence to challenge me? He looked at me and his tone was cold. Grace, you really act like a madman now. At that moment, it seemed as if we went from being the two people who loved each other the most in the world to being each other's most terrible enemies in an instant. Pulling myself away from the memories, after a long silence, in the empty hall, I spoke again with a firm tone, Henry, let's get a divorce. Just at this moment, the cigarette in his hand was lit to the end. He didn't have time to let go and was burned. He put out the cigarette with trembling hands. Then, he dared to look up at me. After just one glance, he lowered his head, as if he didn't dare to look at her again. He squeezed the cigarette box hard in his hands, making a dull sound. No one knew what was going through his mind during this silent time. After a long while, he finally spoke, his voice stuttering, is it because of Betty? He thought about it and said slowly, as long as you say you mind, I can make her disappear. When did the once clean and clear-minded Henry become the cruel and selfish man he is today? I asked him, she is still pregnant with your child. That's not my child. Henry had a sneer on his face. You believe everything she says. If she says it's mine, then it's mine? My child can only be Henry. I interrupted him calmly. I don't care, whether it's Betty or Lee Betty, I don't care at all now, so you don't have to tell me these. I only want you to agree to a divorce. Under the incandescent light, Henry's face was as pale as paper, and a sick smile flashed in his eyes. Yes, of course you don't care. You, Grace, are a dead pool now. Even if I die in front of you now, you won't blink an eye. What else do you care about? I no longer had the desire to argue with him. I looked at him as if he were a willful child, stood up, and said calmly, regarding divorce, I hope you can give me an answer tomorrow. Henry's voice sounded behind him, hoarse and obscure. What if I don't agree? What if I don't agree to divorce, Grace? I stood at the corner of the stairs, put my hand on the handrail, and turned to look at him. The man I loved when I was young gradually overlapped with the figure in front of me, and I couldn't help but feel sad. Henry, I have not been happy at all in these years with you, and this unhappiness is depriving me of my life inch by inch. I let the tears fall and told him clearly, word by word, sometimes when I fall asleep at night, I wonder if I will never wake up the next day. We should have divorced 4 years ago. We have been entangled in vain for so many years, but it was just because we were unwilling to accept it. We always wondered why I should give in to other women. Henry leaned back on the soft sofa like a sitting sculpture, his proud head lowered, his figure disappeared into the darkness, and he didn't say another word. When I woke up the next day, Henry was gone. I looked at the empty villa and realized that he was escaping. I don't understand what he wants at this point. But since I had made up my mind to divorce and had talked it out with him, I felt much better. The heavy emotions that had been weighing on me for years seemed to disappear all of a sudden. 3 days later, Henry's family held a charity dinner, and before the division, I still had to attend as Henry's wife. On the day of the dinner, Henry still didn't show up and no one could control him. But that night, I unexpectedly saw an old acquaintance, and I called out uncertainly, Alex? A man in a neat suit stood under the light, looking lonely and arrogant, looking down at the ground nonchalantly, with laziness and indifference. The moment he turned around, the cold expression on his face warmed up for a moment. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and said politely, Grace. I was a little surprised to see him here. I sent the guest invitations myself, so I naturally remembered that I sent it to him. I was surprised that he would come out to participate in these activities. Alex is famous for being low-key in the entertainment industry. Even though he has won many Best Actor awards and has many famous masterpieces, he is as inconspicuous as a transparent person in the entertainment industry. His fans even think that being an actor might just be his side job. I remember one year, Alex's rivals spent 3 months digging up dirt on him, but all they found was his past of being an excellent student and good student. It can be said that this digging of dirt directly elevated him to the highest position. Then I thought, after all, Alex was Henry's roommate for 4 years in college, maybe he came for Henry's sake. When I was in college, they sometimes had dinner parties in the dormitory, and Henry would bring me along, and we became familiar with each other after a while. I still remember when Henry introduced me to Alex at our first dinner party in their dormitory. We both saw surprise in each other's eyes because we had met by chance twice before. But at that time, in order to avoid misunderstanding, I stood behind Henry and winked at Alex, and he cooperated tacitly. At that time, there was a legend in S University that there was a handsome guy like a volcano and a handsome guy like an iceberg in the computer department. The sunny and warm Henry was considered to be the volcano, while the cold and aloof Alex was the iceberg. The two were equally knowledgeable and well-off, and outsiders often compared them, but at that time, all their friends knew that Henry and Alex were better than close friends. Such a promising young man who should have pursued a career in academia plunged headfirst into the entertainment industry in his graduation year, causing a huge stir at S University. When I think about it carefully, after graduating from college, I seem to have never seen him again except on TV. I looked up at him, smiled and greeted, "How have you been these years?" Alex's eyes were bright and sparkling, and he nodded, "I'm fine." We hadn't seen each other for a long time, and silence stretched out between us. When I wanted to say I was leaving first, Alex suddenly spoke in a very soft voice, inexplicably with some sadness, "You have not been happy these years." It was not a question but a statement, a very impolite and offensive statement. But his expression looked particularly sincere. He was in that circle and must know about Betty's affairs. I suddenly remembered the storm Alex caused on Facebook 2 years ago. As his fans said, Alex is a very Buddhist person. No matter how those people in the entertainment industry try to discredit him or take advantage of his popularity, he never even bats an eye. The only difference was that time, when Betty used him to hype herself up, he personally posted a Facebook message to refute the rumor. It's hard to imagine how a cold person like him could come up with those offensive words. Thinking of this, I smiled at him. Yes, but I will be out of this suffering soon. Alex turned his head and looked at me with a questioning look in his eyes, but he didn't ask. He just curled his lips and said, "Congratulations." The smile on my lips grew unconsciously, a smile that came from the bottom of my heart. Over the past few days, everyone who heard that I wanted a divorce shook their head and said I was stupid. They always have a set of excuses to try to get me to keep this broken marriage and secure my position as Henry's wife. They advised me that Henry just had a mistress and it didn't mean he didn't love you. They say that all men are like this. There is no man in the world who doesn't cheat. As long as he is willing to go home, it's fine. This was the first time I heard the word congratulations. I raised my glass and happily clinked it with Alex's glass. "Alex, what did you say to my wife?" "So happy." As the voice fell, there was a big hand on my waist. My body tensed up for a moment, and even my hand holding the wine glass became a little stiff. Henry half held me in his arms in an intimate manner. I raised my head and met his emotionless dark eyes. "Long time no see, Henry." Alex glanced at me, then extended his hand to Henry, politely keeping his distance. Henry turned his eyes away from me and looked lazily at Alex, curling his lips. "It's been a long time, I'll have someone treat you well. Grace and I have something else to do, let's get together next time when we have time." Hearing this, I glanced at Henry and saw that his jaw was clenched, and I didn't know what he was thinking. There was nothing much to say to Henry, so I nodded to Alex and left first. But I didn't know that behind me, Alex called Henry. He asked Henry, "You loved her so much back then, I thought you would always treat her well." Henry just stood there, his face cold, and there was a hint of anger in his eyes as he looked at Alex, as if he could engulf the person opposite him. After a while, he suddenly smiled nonchalantly. "Does it have anything to do with you?" Henry couldn't figure out what he was afraid of. He knew in college that Alex's type was not Grace. Without waiting for Alex to reply, he said coldly, "Alex, stay away from Grace." After dinner that day, Henry seemed to disappear again. I didn't expect that the scene would be like that when I saw Henry again. At 5 o'clock in the evening on September 12th, a hostage-taking incident occurred in the Baihua commercial building, and I happened to be held hostage with a knife pointed at my neck. The scene was in chaos, some were escaping for their lives, some were calling the police, but everyone was running outside without exception. However, I couldn't just follow the crowd. I tried my best to keep my trembling body balanced, but I couldn't control my fear. The criminal screamed at the top of his lungs, "Don't come over here, or I'll kill her. Let the police come and talk to me." The one who arrived earlier than the police was Henry. He seemed to be running towards me from outside, with messy black hair, and his face turned extremely pale the moment he saw me. Henry took a few steps forward, provoking the gangster's anger. "Don't come over." He steadied his steps, tried hard to control his anxiety, and said in a steady voice, "I won't go over. You want money, right? If you let her go, I will give you as much money as you want. The police will not pursue you. I can protect you." The gangster yelled at him, "I don't want money, I just want justice, I want the police to communicate with me." He put all his belongings on the ground and held up his cell phone to show him, "Well, let me exchange her. I am the chairman of the Henry family. You are more valuable if you hold me hostage. I can help you talk to the police." I looked at him with wide eyes and said with difficulty, "Don't come over, he has a bomb on him." Henry was still trying to persuade people. He was always good at convincing people. Plus, the criminal was so excited that he actually listened to him and exchanged the hostages. When he came over, the gangster took out another knife from his body and stabbed him hard in the arm to weaken his resistance, then put the knife on his neck and pushed me away. Henry looked at me deeply, bent over and cooperated with the criminals, and said in a hoarse voice, "Run out, don't look back. The police arrived soon." I grabbed their hands, looked back at Henry, and begged them to save him. They sent me out forcefully and I squatted on the ground with a blank mind. It was not until I could no longer hold on and knelt on the ground that the door opened from the inside. There was no explosion as expected, nor was there a cold, breathless Henry. I leaned on the stairs, my face wet with tears, and watched Henry walk out with one hand covering his arm. He came over and picked me up from the ground. I buried my head in his arms, crying out of breath. For a moment, I was panicking. I called him, "Henry." "Yes, I'm here." He lowered his head and responded softly. I almost cried and asked him, "You are not even afraid of death, why?" I didn't ask any further questions, and Henry remained silent. Because we all know that the unasked question is, "You are not afraid of death, so why don't you have the courage to love only one person for your whole life?" Henry, is it really that difficult to love only one person in your life? After a long silence, Henry held me in his arms with trembling hands and pleaded in a timid voice, Grace, let's live a good life from now on, I beg you. When the accident was making headlines in the social news, Henry was on a business trip abroad. The day before I went to the obstetrics hospital, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, from the startling chirping of birds to the setting sun. No matter how hard-hearted I am, I can't help but imagine what this child will be like, whether he will be a little noisy or well-behaved. I raised my hand and patted it gently, crying and saying sorry to it. I'm sorry to meet you at such an inopportune time. I'm sorry that I can't bring you into this world. However, I was in the hospital and saw Betty. I just found out that a lot of negative information about her had been exposed online during this period, and her acting career was almost ruined. As her victim, I actually quite enjoy watching her, but I am too lazy to mock her. Just as I turned to go in, Betty suddenly spotted me and rushed towards me. I didn't have time to step back, and at this moment, the bodyguard who had been following me grabbed her. Betty looked at me fiercely and said sternly, You instigated Henry to take away my child, didn't you? Grace, you bitch. I opened my mouth and looked at her in disbelief, and for a moment, my throat felt a little blocked. Betty struggled hard, her eyes turned from vicious to red. You are going to divorce him, and after you leave, who will be Henry's wife? I have been with him for so many years. She choked up, Grace, I admit that I hooked up with him for money in the beginning. I tried my best to seduce him and make him invest resources in me, but I really love him now, I love him very much, I want to marry him and spend the rest of my life with him. Betty, I interrupted her and advised her calmly but viciously, don't be a mistress and interfere in other people's marriages next time, it will not end well. I turned around and let her call behind me. Grace, can you please speak to Henry for me and ask him not to chase me away, please? After the farce, I felt a little tired and stood at the door of the clinic for a long time. I looked up at the slanting sunlight, straightened my back, and walked in resolutely without hesitation. As that little life slowly slipped away from my body, my tears seemed to slowly dry up as well. It was like crying one last time for these 12 failed yet beautiful years. The day after I returned from the hospital, Henry flew back from London. He rushed back to the villa exhausted and asked with bloodshot eyes, What are you doing in the obstetrics and gynecology hospital? I said, I had the baby aborted. Henry went crazy and smashed everything in the room. Finally, he put his hands on his waist and pointed at me with trembling fingers. Grace, why, that's our child. He knelt on the ground, covered his face with his hands, buried his head in my legs, and his shoulders trembled constantly. Grace, that's our child. I looked at him calmly. The crazy Henry now was just like the crazy me 4 years ago. But I didn't feel any joy in my heart, only endless sadness. This child, I just let him cross the line because I was unintentionally soft-hearted on his birthday. It was a mistake from the beginning. I sighed, Henry, let's get a divorce. I wouldn't agree to that. I asked him, or do you want me to die little by your side? When Henry heard this, his eyes trembled suddenly, and he stood stiffly in place, looking at me with helplessness in his eyes. Henry stayed in the room for the whole day with the door locked, from dawn to sunset, when he finally opened the door and walked out. He looked at me and said calmly, Grace, I promise you. Filing a lawsuit or prosecuting is the last thing I want to do. I don't want to make things so ugly. I couldn't help but feel relieved that he agreed calmly. The divorce procedure was completed quickly, in just 3 days. During these 3 days, Henry seemed to be the same as before, taking care of everything with a smile and talking to me in a casual manner. On the day we left the villa, I squatted on the floor to pack my luggage while Henry sat on the sofa and watched quietly. After a while, he finally spoke, You have 3% of the original shares of all the companies under my name, you can do whatever you want with them. The houses on Hengshan Road and the villa in Shishan Park have all been transferred to your name. He took out a bank card and placed it on the table. There is a deposit of 300 million yuan into this card, take it. This is the first time I know about original shares, but I am too lazy to ask about it now. The things Henry gave me are enough for me to spend without worries for several lifetimes. I can't be so noble as to say that I don't want your money. So I took the card and accepted the whole thing, saying he owed me this, thank you. He leaned against the sofa, and only his eyes showed some vitality, moving from time to time following my figure. After about 10 minutes, he suddenly said, Grace, it's late today, stay one more night, I will take you there tomorrow. I looked up at him, curved my lips and shook my head. No need, my mother is here to pick me up. Henry stood up when he heard this, Mom is here? I'll go get her up. He hurriedly picked up his coat and was about to go out. I called out to him, "Hey, Henry, don't go." He stopped and looked at me with some confusion. "My mother used to praise you every time she saw me." I thought about it and remembered that she kept repeating in my ear those words about Henry being sensible and caring. I told her that she really liked you before, but you hurt her daughter. I don't think she wants to see you anymore. Henry pinched his coat with such force that his fingers turned white. He took a few steps back and sat back on the sofa dejectedly. When I pushed my suitcase to the elevator door, Henry hung his head and did not move. I called him, "Henry." "Hey." He looked up and said, smiling at me, "I thought that when we divorced, we would tear each other apart and make a scene that everyone would know about, but I never thought that when this day came, we would be so respectful to each other." I smiled and said, "I'm leaving." He wanted to send me off, but I stopped him, and we were separated by that door. He looked down at the threshold and blinked. "If there is anything you can't handle in the future, come to me. As long as I still have the ability, I will not ignore your affairs." I turned around, waved, and said nothing. After my divorce, I logged into my Facebook account, which I hadn't used for a while, and posted a newly drawn cartoon. Soon a fan came to comment. "Am I seeing things? This was drawn by Master Shiryu? The one above is her. I didn't expect to see Shiryu return to her old style in my lifetime. It's so sweet. Who understands? Shiryu has been drawing those dark styles in recent years. If I didn't really love her, I would have stopped being her fan long ago." I thought of the shadow of my unhappy marriage in the past few years, and even the things I painted were tinged with death. I couldn't help but feel again that divorce was the right decision. I scrolled down and saw a familiar ID, "Great drawing. I hope you can be happy every day in the future." This ID is considered an old fan of mine. I remember that when I released my first work in my sophomore year, he followed me. After that, he would silently like every Facebook post of mine, and comment on every work of mine, saying, "Well done." Even though my works have been criticized in recent years, he still insisted that they were well drawn and told me not to give up. I curled the corners of my lips and replied to him, "Thank you." Strangely enough, the person I run into most often these days is Alex. Once, he was walking a dog. I stared at it for a long time before asking him, "Which dog is this?" During my sophomore year, Henry and I picked up an abandoned puppy outside of school. We took it for a checkup, and the dog's ownership became an issue. But neither of us is a patient person, not to mention that I was busy drawing comics at the time. At that time, Alex offered to help solve the problem. I thought he would give the dog away, but I didn't expect him to raise the dog. Alex smiled, with dimples faintly visible on his lips. "Yes, it's old now and doesn't come out for a walk often." I squatted down with some surprise, touched it, and found it unexpectedly friendly. I sighed and said, "You have taken good care of it. It also has children." Alex paused here and said, "If you want to see, it should be very happy." I didn't think much about it and nodded, "I'll take a look when I have a chance." Actually, I had no intention of actually going to see the dogs, it would have been too intimate and inappropriate. But the next day, Alex brought the puppy over. As soon as the dog saw me, it wagged its tail and was very friendly. No one can resist the closeness of a puppy, and I am no exception. I can only blame Alex for raising them to be too unfamiliar with strangers. But later, I found out that the dog Alex raised was as aloof as he was, and he wouldn't even let ordinary people touch it. In the adult world, it is easy to see through emotions, especially since Alex doesn't hide them at all. Later, I could only tell him, "Alex, I am not ready to enter a new relationship, I enjoy my current life. Moreover, I have a fear of marriage." Alex pursed his lips and smiled, "Grace, don't be afraid. I told you that I like you not to make you respond to me, nor do I want you to be with me. I just hope that in the future, at any time, whether you are happy or unhappy, you can think that there is someone in this world who is attracted to you and impressed by you, and it has always been and will be in the future." Sometimes, I wonder how Alex can blend indifference and gentleness so perfectly. 2 years later, Alex's studio, which had been silent for a long time, officially announced the good news of his marriage, which triggered a hot search. Along with the shock and discussion came the dig into Alex's wife. Following clues, netizens recognized that the wife Alex was going to marry was the ex-wife of the chairman of the Henry family. At one point, some netizens who couldn't accept it rushed into Alex's Facebook and scolded him for marrying a divorced woman. What's worse, some people even went to the official account of Henry family to insult them, and Henry family directly closed the comment section. A financial reporter who heard the news took the opportunity to interview Henry and asked him what he thought. Henry stood in front of the camera for a long time before he said congratulations. Alex held a press conference, where he said sincerely and earnestly, "If it weren't for her, I probably wouldn't have gotten married in my life, so I ask you to be happy for me. The fact that I can still get married in my life is a blessing from fate." After the press conference, netizens fell inexplicably silent. Throughout Alex's life, he never cared no matter what people in the entertainment industry and the public said about him. The only two high-profile and ostentatious scandals he caused were both because of Grace. After a period of silence, some fans dug out Alex's secondary account and discovered a secret he had hidden for many years. On the day Alex debuted, his second account once posted a Facebook message, "If I stand tall, can she see me?" Suddenly, there was a huge discussion on the internet, and many writers even started writing fan fiction about the love entanglement between Alex, Grace, and Henry. Grace lowered her head, watching the detective netizens analyzing the situation clearly, and clicked on the familiar ID with her hand. Then, he ran to the kitchen barefoot with his cell phone. Alex was wearing a light gray home suit and was bending over to cut fruit for Grace. Grace called out tentatively, "Sure you is great?"
"Yeah."
Alex, who was bending over and immersed in the fruit platter, responded subconsciously. The next second, his body stiffened and he turned around to look at Grace. He turned his head again and whispered, "I don't know what you are talking about, go put on your shoes." Grace looked at the ID named Shuriwe Bangbangda on the phone, then looked at Alex, covering her forehead and laughing loudly. Alex couldn't help but laugh along with the wanton and exaggerated laughter behind him. Alex and Grace's wedding was a sensation known throughout the city. On the day of their wedding, Jack rushed from the airport to the wedding venue. When he got off the car, he met an old acquaintance at the door. Jack looked at the time and decided that he wouldn't be late, so he walked over and patted Henry on the shoulder. "Don't you want to go up and take a look?" Henry weighed the cigarette in his hand and looked up at the magnificent building, where guests were rushing in and out and gongs and drums were beating loudly. He took out a box and handed it to Jack. "Wedding gift, please help me take it up." Jack took the box and raised his eyebrows. "What?" Henry was choked by the smoke and coughed for a long time. Tears welled up in his eyes. Then he smiled and said, "I'm afraid she won't accept it." At the end, he said, "Don't say it was given by me." Jack asked again, "Are you really not going up to take a look?" Henry shook his head. "What were you looking at? In the presence of so many guests, do you see them swearing to grow old together and see how they love each other?" He probably couldn't accept that the person who was once at the top of his heart, the person he valued so much, the person he had used all his strength to embrace, was eventually embraced by someone else. Jack patted his shoulder and said, "I'll go up and ask for a glass of wedding wine." Perhaps since he has never had it before, it wouldn't be so hard for him to let it go, and he wouldn't be so out of control. Jack watched Henry slowly walk into the crowd, his back looking desolate and bleak. He smiled inaudibly, his intuition telling him that Henry would never make it in this life, and this was just the beginning. Henry managed to get into the car with some strength, and looked up at the building blankly. He never thought that Alex had kept his thoughts hidden for so many years. When he found out, he wanted to kill him. Henry lowered his head and suddenly laughed, laughing until his chest was shaking. I lowered my eyes, gently placed my hands on my flat abdomen, and couldn't help trembling all over. When Grace left, she did not take her favorite birthday gift with her, and it was left gathering dust in the villa. He would also not tell Grace that when someone slandered her on the forum that year, he was too late to deal with it, and Alex handled everything by himself. At that time, Henry patted him on the shoulder and called him a good brother, and Alex said nothing. Henry always thought that Alex helped because of him. Thinking about it now, every word was like a knife, stabbing straight into his chest. In this life, he would never tell Grace what Alex had done. He would rot with these secrets, too selfish to give them any chance to love more deeply. The car drove slowly into the night, and Henry gradually drifted away from the noisy joy behind him.